Welcome to part 2 for us of the Climate Solutions 101 series that has been put together by Project Drawdown. I unfortunately was not able to attend the last one due to child conflicts, so I wasn't here. Is anybody new to this, or did you all see the last one? Looks like everybody saw the last one. Great. Or Sarah didn't. Well, I do want to really quickly introduce, before we get started, Sarah Mason is here. She's with the Climate Advocacy Workshop. Am I saying that right? Not Climate Citizen. I wrote those. Citizens Climate Lobby. I read the wrong piece on my paper. So Sarah is here. If you don't mind, I'm going to let them ask you questions towards the end. Is that all right? Okay. So she is here. If at the end you want to chat with her, we'll give her an opportunity to answer any of your questions. She's probably much more knowledgeable than I am on all of this. Perhaps not. We'll see. But if you all recall, the Project Drawdown is a group that is working hard to try and reach the point of drawdown. And drawdown is the point at which, instead of increasing our emissions, we start drawing them down. And so they have put together this series, Climate Solutions 101. It's a 6-part series available on their website. So if you watch it and you want to see it again, it's just Google Climate Solutions 101, Project Drawdown. Pops up first option there. We can also send it to you via link if you need that. But they have a series. They want everybody to kind of watch it. It is very informative. Thankfully, you guys have watched 1 and 2. I watched it on my own. Today, we're gonna try and watch at least 3 and 4. 3 is actually about 20, 23 minutes. So we're thinking we probably cannot get to 5 or 6, maybe 5 today. But what I want you to think about while you're watching them is whether you would be interested to get back together as a group to watch the last 2, or if you'd prefer to watch them on your own. I'll let you think about that, and we'll kind of do a little vote at the end. But if we want to watch them together, we'll just set up another date for that. Tyler is handing around some cards, so that'll give you a chance as you're watching. If you just want to jot down a thought for yourself to remember later, you can. If you want to write down a topic, we'll try and give a little time at the end that we can discuss things that have come to mind during the session. All right? So without further ado, let's get it going because we don't have a lot of time.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about reducing the sources of greenhouse gas pollution. I already told you that this is going to be key to addressing climate change. We're going to stop the problem before it even gets into the atmosphere. And that's the way we need to begin. So we're going to zoom in and look at all the different contributors to the sources of greenhouse gas pollution and how we can bring these things down to zero and stop the problem at its tracks. Well, what are the sources of this greenhouse gas pollution to begin with? Well, you've heard of a few of them, but some of them are going to be kind of surprising. One of the places we should begin is the biggest emitting sector of greenhouse gases, which is making electricity. It turns out that burning coal in a power plant or natural gas creates carbon dioxide, and that is a big contributor to climate change. Overall, across the world, it's about 1/4 of the problem. In some countries it's bigger, in some countries it's smaller, but the globe as a whole is 25%. The next biggest source of greenhouse gases often surprises people, and it's 24%, is food. It turns out that growing food and agriculture and the land use associated with all of that together is about 24% of our emissions. Isn't that weird that electricity and food are about equal and together are half of climate change? We hear a lot more about the electricity space, though, than we do the food space. It turns out they're about equally important. Then we switch over to industry, kind of making all the stuff in the world. We'll go through a lot of those different things, but making steel and cements and plastics and other things, as well as managing waste, is what's happening here, and that's 21% of the problem. Then we've got transportation, moving us and our goods around the planet, whether it's a car, a truck, a plane, a ship, and whatever. That's about 14% of the problem. Then we go to buildings, Buildings cause about 6% of climate change. But to be fair, buildings also are using a lot of the electricity. They're responsible for some of the industrial emissions to make the components of buildings. And of course, transportation takes us from building to building. So buildings directly, from their furnaces, their hot water heaters, boilers, and air conditioners, emit greenhouse gases, but they have a big effect on a lot of the other sectors. So how we build buildings and what we do with buildings and the design of cities is crucial throughout all of those wedges of our pie chart. Then we've got the remaining 10%. That's a lot of different things, but it's actually dominated by the energy industry. It's going to be responsible for things like fugitive emissions, the kind of leaks of methane and natural gas that aren't intentional, or when they flare off natural gas in an oil well, or the emissions when we refine crude oil into things we use like diesel fuel, gasoline, and so on. So energy industry and a few other things show up in that last 10%. But look at the first 5. It's kind of amazing that only 5 things, electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings, cause 90% of climate change. Well, heck, that's just one hand. We can solve 90% of the problems with just this. That's pretty good. So let's go through each of these sectors and kind of see what can we do to reduce these emissions and eventually bring them down to zero. So we're going to look at each sector, and then we're going to dive into particular solutions, and we're going to show you how at Project Drawdown we've tried to estimate the size of these different solutions and which ones might work best. So let's start with electricity. Electricity, again, produces about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases. And the production of electricity burning fossil fuels, especially coal and natural gas, causes those emissions. But we can also look at how electricity is used. Most of the world's electricity is used in buildings for lighting and air conditioning, heating, refrigeration, all those kinds of things. And about the other half or so is used in industry, making stuff, big industrial, big machine processes. The rest is about 2% that's used in food and transportation and everything else. So buildings and industry are the big users. Well, let's make this kind of real. Burning coal and natural gas in a power plant is what produces these emissions, and that's what makes electricity, and sometimes we use the heat in a power plant for something else as well. We take that electricity, we put it in buildings, industry, and everywhere else. And the kind of electricity we make is associated with the electricity that's in the grid, but also the greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere. For example, burning coal releases about 2 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour of electricity we use. Natural gas is a little less. It's more like 1.2 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour we produce. Then we have solar, wind, nuclear, and other forms of making electricity that don't produce any CO2. So this is a big difference between the fossil fuels electricity and the non-fossil fuel electricity. It's a huge, huge difference. Now let's make this real. A kilowatt hour is what we use to measure electricity consumption. A kilowatt hour is like using 1,000 watts for 1 hour. A hairdryer uses about 1,000 watts. So if you turned on a hairdryer and left it there for an hour, that's 1 kilowatt hour of electrical use. Pretty simple. Well, the average American home uses 1,000 kilowatt hours every month, on average. Some use more, some use less, for all the different things we use electricity for. Well, if we do the math, 1,000 kilowatt hours on America's electrical grids, which releases on average about 1.4 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour, that means an average American home is responsible for over 16,000 pounds of CO2 pollution, or over 8 tons. That's incredible. How would we reduce that? Well, we already kind of know, don't we? We can have energy efficiency. We could reduce the use of electricity. No matter how the electricity is made, we could probably cut it in half with better lighting, better air conditioners, better appliances, and so on. But then we can also switch the way we make electricity to things like renewables that don't emit any CO2 at all. So that 1-2 punch of efficiency and transforming to renewables is key here. While Drawdown, we looked at those solutions not at your home level, but at the larger economy level, at the whole planet. And we looked at a whole bunch of solutions that could enhance efficiency, many of which are in buildings and automation, are all listed here. And we also looked at ways we can shift electricity production away from coal and gas to things like solar and wind, hydro, geothermal, biomass, nuclear, and beyond. We also have to do a few other things, by the way, like improving the grid. We have to have electricity dispatched and stored in new ways to accommodate renewables. And we also have to have more flexibility in how electricity is used. But if we put all these things together, a whole bunch of efficiency solutions, a whole bunch of solutions about producing energy in new ways, and improving the grid, we have an enormous suite of climate solutions right here in electricity. In this picture, each of those solutions is represented by a single circle. The bigger the circle, the bigger the climate solution. Some of those circles actually have two rings, an inner one and an outer one, and that kind of represents a range of estimates we've made about how big that solution could be over the next 30 years or so. So there are a lot of good solutions here in efficiency and making electricity in new ways. Really exciting. Well, let's look at food. Food's also a big emitter of greenhouse gases. Again, about a quarter, 24% of our emissions come from food. A lot of folks, though, think the food emissions come from things like moving food around or food miles you might hear about, or if we grow food maybe organically or with conventional ag or GMOs. We talk about that stuff all the time, but it turns out those aren't the big issues. The really big issues in agriculture emissions for climate change are actually three other things. They're deforestation, kind of burning down forest for new agricultural land. Most of the deforestation on the planet today is happening in Brazil and Indonesia and a few other countries. In Brazil and Indonesia, we're clearing a lot of land for cattle and soybeans that are used to feed animals, mostly in Brazil. So animal agriculture is hugely responsible for deforestation there. In Indonesia, it's mostly for palm oil, being used as a cooking oil, mainly in China and India, but also used as kind of an ingredient in a lot of other foods. The next big area is methane from our animals and a little bit from rice fields. And again, animal agriculture is really important here because cattle and cows burp methane, as we talked about before, and that methane builds up in the atmosphere, causing a big level of new climate change. Basically, we're going to have to rethink meat and dairy products in order to reduce those emissions, either having a lot less of it or growing it in really different ways. Then we have nitrous oxide, that gas I talked about before, which is often produced by using fertilizer too much. Whether that's fertilizer that's chemical fertilizer or manure, they both have nitrogen in them. And if we put too much on a field under certain conditions, that nitrogen can come off into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a major greenhouse gas. A lot of the rest, by the way, will run off into the water and cause pollution in streams and watersheds and lakes and even entire oceans. So managing nitrogen and fertilizers is going to be a real big problem, both for climate change, but also for ecosystems and our water. So to solve those problems, we can again look for a third of the food grown on the planet. Food waste is so crazy. In rich countries, we use far too much food and throw away a lot of it, and it's never even eaten, and that's just tragic. In poor countries, though, food waste is often about the same number, but it happens closer to the farmer, because maybe the crop didn't get to the marketplace, maybe it rotted in storage, or it never got on the truck, or the train broke down. So we lose food there too, and the farmer loses their income, kind of a double tragedy. So food waste is actually a huge problem, not only for climate change, but food security and a lot of other things. It's a problem worth solving. We also have to think about diets. I showed you how meat and dairy products were responsible for a lot of the big drivers of these emissions. So eating more plants and less meat-based products is a really simple, kind of easy, thing to do. If meat and dairy are responsible for a lot of emissions, let's eat a little less of that stuff and then grow what we do eat better. We also have to protect ecosystems from being cleared. Can we put up big fences and just say no to deforestation, stop them in their tracks? Make sure we don't clear forest, and especially forests with peatlands under them that have carbon in the trees, but carbon in the peat below ground. But then finally, we can also improve the way we farm on the lands we still are farming. That's going to be a whole bunch of different things about using water better and nutrients better, tilling the soil less, putting on cover crops, all sorts of things. And you'll hear a lot of excitement about regenerative agriculture, which kind of mimics nature's way of doing things as we farm. Regenerative agriculture and these other farming practices can reduce emissions a lot, and that's really crucial. Later, we're going to talk about the potential of some of those farming techniques to not only reduce pollution, but also create new carbon sinks that might absorb CO2 and put it into the soil. That's pretty cool too. But for now, we're just talking about reducing the emissions from farms. Well, let's put all this together. It turns out by looking at all the food solutions, we see food waste is huge. Changing our diets can be huge. Protecting ecosystems, especially forest and forest with peatlands below them, are really important, and farming differently is a major contributor too. So the solutions to the food system climate problem are partly due to us, partly things about ecosystems, and partly what's happening on the farms. We can all do our part here. Well, then let's flip to industry. In industry, we make a whole bunch of things that take high temperature, very intensive processes to make, like metals, especially steel. Steel is a big contributor to climate change. Cement. Making cement releases a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. Our chemicals and also plastics, things like that, each make some CO2 as well. By the way, we hear a lot about plastic being a big climate problem. It is. It's about 1.5% of climate change is tied to producing, using, and disposing of all the world's plastic. Definitely a problem, but it's even more of a problem out in the larger environment because it's affecting marine ecosystems and causing pollution all sorts of other places too. And then finally, managing waste. And the gases used in managing waste, but also released from landfills, is crucial. We're going to look at that too. So we're going to look at all sorts of industrial processes, manufacturing and materials, and how we process and manage waste across all of those different domains. At Drawdown, we've looked at a few already and put numbers on them, like what can we do with cement, what can we do with plastics, and then we look at a specific suite of chemicals called refrigerants, which are all these fluorinated gases. It turns out that fluorinated gases like chlorofluorocarbons are very dangerous. Back in the 70s, we realized that chlorofluorocarbons were actually hurting the ozone layer way up in the upper atmosphere. They also contributed to global warming. But we phased out most of those chlorofluorocarbons and replaced them with hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Those don't hurt the ozone layer, thank goodness, but they still contribute to climate change. So they're ozone friendly, but not climate friendly. We're going to probably have to replace them again and replace them with climate friendly refrigerants and make sure that none of the existing refrigerants leak and get into the atmosphere. We've also looked at ways we can use waste as a resource. Rather than throwing something away and never using it again, the kind of recycling, repurposing, and actually using energy from our waste streams is a really clever idea, which makes just all sorts of sense. So if we think about improving materials, especially refrigerants, and using waste as a resource, we have a lot of solutions already appearing in the industrial sector. We've got a few more to work on, especially steel and a few other things, but we've got a good start here. Then we got transportation. Transportation is about 14% of the problem. Most of that is on road transportation. 10 of that 14% is in roads, cars, trucks, things like that. The flying we do, aviation, is a little less than 2%. That's all the commercial and military aviation on the planet is about 1.8% of global emissions. Everything else is another 2% or so. That's going to be ships and trains and other things. But mainly it's roads, planes, and the rest. CO2 is made here, that's pretty clear, by burning the fuels we use in transportation. Gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel. When we burn these liquid fuels, it releases carbon dioxide into the air. Well, let's take this to everyday life. Like imagine a gallon of gasoline. You pick up a gallon of water, it weighs about 8 pounds. Gasoline's a little bit lighter, call it 7 pounds. If you burn a gallon of gasoline, which is mostly made up of carbon, you add oxygen to it, 2 atoms of oxygen for every one of those carbon atoms, that 7 pounds becomes 20 pounds of pollution. And that 20 pounds of pollution goes into the atmosphere right out of your tailpipe and goes into the air and stays there for centuries, long after you're dead. Can you imagine that? Just burning 1 gallon of gas releases 20 pounds of pollution that could be up there for 1,000 years maybe? That's incredible. So it turns out driving the average American car, which gets about 25 miles per gallon, driven about 15,000 miles a year, produces almost 12,000 pounds of CO2 pollution, which will last for centuries. That's about 6 tons of pollution. It's more than your car weighs, is what we put in the sky by a big margin. Fuel efficiency is crucial though. If we go from 25 miles per gallon, which is crazy low, to 50, which is just kind of modest at this day and age, we can actually take that 12,000 pounds and bring it down to something like 5,000 to 6,000 pounds. That's a good step. Planes, again, use about 1.8% of the problem here, and that's caused by just burning aviation fuel in those planes, releasing CO2 as well. But we're getting a little bit more efficient in aviation. Today's planes use about 50 to 60 miles per gallon equivalent for every passenger on the plane. It'd be like driving a hybrid car, but the problem is you're going a lot of distance really fast and you can keep doing it. So when we think about transportation, we can look at efficiency, making the current things more efficient, like fuel efficiency in cars, more efficient airplanes, more efficient trucks, and so on. And we can also look for alternatives to fossil fuel transportation, like walking, bicycling, mass transit, or video conferencing, where you don't have to go anywhere to hear other ideas or meet other people. Those are all really great. And then we can switch from a liquid kind of hydrocarbon fossil fueled vehicle to an electric vehicle. Electric cars are here to stay. They're better. They're going to be cheaper. They're going to be fun and useful and cheaper to operate. We're getting electric trains, of course, electric trucks, and other things. This is really crucial. But putting this all together, efficiency of our current vehicles, shifting to other ways of getting around, and then electrifying our new vehicles, there are a lot of great solutions to transportation. Okay, let's get to buildings. They emit directly about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, they're affecting electricity, transportation, and other areas as well. But what buildings emit directly within their building envelope are primarily from residential buildings. About 2 to 1 of these emissions are from homes and apartments compared to public and commercial buildings. So we're talking a lot about homes, apartments, as well as big public buildings too. Well, we emit greenhouse gases directly from buildings in our furnaces and boilers and hot water heaters, because they're going to burn natural gas or maybe fuel oil, heating oil, things like that. And those emit CO2 right from your basement. But buildings can also release refrigerants from air conditioners and refrigerators kind of accidentally if there are any leaks in your air conditioning equipment or your refrigerators and your freezers. That's why we always should be tuning those up and watching them. In a typical American home, we actually use a lot of natural gas to heat our spaces, especially in a cold place like Minnesota, where I live, or to heat our hot water for taking showers and things like that. And we measure natural gas in what are called therms. A therm is 100,000 BTUs worth of heat, and that's what your gas meter is measuring it in. The average home in a cold part of America uses about 1,000 therms every year, and that would add up to about 13,000 pounds of CO2, more than your car in a lot of cases. So again, we have to think about electricity and transportation, but also the energy used within our buildings, often as natural gas or heating oil, in order to tackle climate change. So that's why building efficiency matters so much. A lot of buildings are still too inefficient. They leak heat out, they pour heat in during the summer. We can make buildings really much more efficient. We can always build new green buildings, of course, but we're going to have to do a lot to retrofit the hundreds of millions of buildings that already exist. Then we got to shift to new energy sources that don't burn fossil fuels to heat our homes, cool our food, and give us nice hot showers. And we've got to pay special attention to the refrigerants in air conditioners and freezers and refrigerators, because when those leak, they become a kind of super pollutant, causing disproportionate climate change. When we look here, we see energy efficiency, shifting energy resources, and addressing refrigerants are going to be the crucial aspects of buildings in climate change. Let's wrap up here. Now we've got the last sector, which is everything else, the other category, about 10%. A lot of this is from the energy sector itself when they flare off natural gas in an oil well, or what are called fugitive emissions, which are kind of the emissions that escape accidentally from a fracking well of natural gas, or a coal mine, or a leaky natural gas pipeline. These are things we should demand the energy industry address right now. These are super low-hanging fruits that if the energy industry cared at all about this, we could shut off like 6% of climate change today. So what have we learned? We've learned that attacking the sources of greenhouse gases are the first biggest step to addressing climate change. And there are big 5 areas we should be focusing on: electricity, food, industry, transportation, buildings, and so on. And we can see those here. But then inside those major sectors, we have hundreds of little areas that are all really important to address if we want to solve climate change. There's absolutely no silver bullet here. We do a lot of individual things between flying and cement and plastic, electricity and buildings and food and meat and everything else. All of those little things contribute to climate change. So we're going to have to do a lot of little things together to solve climate change. There are many sources, therefore there are many solutions. We're not going to solve climate change simply with a solar panel, or by eating less meat, or not flying, or not using cement. We've got to do a little bit of all of that stuff. And usually, one of the repeating lessons we saw here is start with efficiency. Wasting less energy, wasting less material, wasting less food. Those are all really crucial. And then switching what we do to something that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. We can still make electricity, but do it differently. We can eat food that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. We can make stuff and live in places and get around without any fossil fuels at all. So between efficiency, where we usually start, and transforming the economy to a low carbon economy, we have some great solutions to tackle climate change.
Sources, identifying the sources of greenhouse gases. The next one is going to be supporting sinks. So how we kind of naturally, as an Earth, take back the greenhouse gases. So the next one's going to be a little bit shorter, and then we'll talk a bit after that one's done.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about reducing the sources of greenhouse gas pollution. I already told you that this is going to be Okay, so in this final unit, we're going to talk about Okay, so now we're going to talk about how we can address climate change by looking at the sinks of greenhouse gases, and also how changes in society can have secondary benefits to climate change. As we think about these issues, one of the best places to begin is supporting nature's carbon cycle. These are things that are naturally sinks of greenhouse gases today. If we zoom in here, we can see how forests and oceans are absorbing over 40% of the pollution we put in the atmosphere every year. Most of that in the form of CO2. And so if we can support those sinks and make sure they stay healthy, that would help us address climate change into the future. But the problem is some of these systems aren't that healthy right now. A lot of our forests are feeling the weight of climate change already, or are being torn down. And our oceans are getting warmer and more acidic, and they're also getting more polluted and over-harvested at the same time. So job number one here is just kind of support nature, give it some backup, and make sure that it isn't diminishing these sinks we already have. Later, hopefully we can augment those sinks by putting other land and other ocean systems into production and add to what nature's doing already. But here's the math we got to start with. 100% of these emissions are coming from us. Land is putting out about 24% or removing it and putting it into our forest. The oceans are pulling out about 17% of the greenhouse gases and putting it into different parts of the ocean. Interestingly, even though oceans cover a lot more of the Earth's surface, they actually take up less of the carbon than land does. Oceans are important, but forests are kind of a big story here. Altogether, that still leaves about 59% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so this is part of the solution, but it can't be the whole solution. And before we look at the individual sinks, there are about 4 major points I think we have to talk about before we even get started. First of all, it is crucial that we give nature support because nature is already doing 40% of all the removal, and we're doing zip. So starting with backing up nature, giving it support, and making sure we don't lose that service of removing greenhouse gases is crucial. Then once we kind of get that stuff secured, we can also maybe add some of our own new carbon sinks, like planting new trees or farming new areas in different ways, or maybe machines that pull carbon out of the atmosphere, all of that. But first, why don't we help out nature that's doing a good job already? The second thing to remember is sinks all have limits. They can't take an infinite amount of greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere. There's no way. Trees only get so big. Soils only go so deep and can have so much carbon in them. Coral reefs can only grow so fast. So we have things that have a limited capacity to absorb our greenhouse gases. That's why it's probably more important to stop them before they ever get in the atmosphere than try to remove them later. And that leads to a third point. Sinks take time to absorb greenhouse gases. If you put out a ton of CO2 today and plant trees to offset that, it might take 100 years for those trees to grow fully to maturity, absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. But in the meantime, you've got 100 years of climate change caused by the pollution you started with. So you can't really get away with this. By planting trees to offset emissions introduces a time lag where climate change is just going to be worse. There's kind of an asymmetry here. Turning off a power plant stops pollution today. Planting trees or building coral reefs or whatever basically is a solution for 50 to 100 years from now. The other thing we have to worry about is sinks may not always be permanent. They might not be secure. For example, some of our sinks are biological in nature, growing a new tree, putting stuff in the soil, putting stuff in a kelp forest or whatever. Those are biological sinks and they're great, but they can also be reversed. We can plant trees and then they could be burned down. We could farm really well and build up the soil, but that farmer retires, the next one comes in and plows it all up and it goes back in the atmosphere instantly. So these kind of biological sinks can sometimes be quite ephemeral. They may not be permanent, but some sinks might be more geological in nature. If we can lock up carbon in kind of like a rock or something like a coral reef or down in the basalt or something like that, then we got something that's locked up pretty much permanently, at least on human timescales. So let's look at these sinks one by one. On land, again, it takes up about 1/4 of our emissions, which is pretty amazing. And it's doing it with photosynthesis. The natural vegetation of our planet, especially trees, are growing a little bit faster now, and they're accumulating more biomass, or essentially wood. And when those things die, they build up a little more carbon in the soil, what we call soil organic matter. So photosynthesis, biomass of the living stuff, and soil organic matter, that's where all the carbon goes. And we can help maintain those sinks in nature by leaving nature alone. We can first take pressure off of nature by not clearing forest, for example. And that's where food waste and diets and things like that, where we don't need to grow more food and invade those forests because we're more efficient with the food we already grow. That'll be crucial. But also putting up kind of big protections around the remaining rainforest and peatland forest and other ecosystems to make sure they're never cleared at all. And then once we've kind of taken care of nature and secured it, then we can do exciting things like putting our farmland into new types of agriculture that might absorb carbon, what we often call regenerative agriculture. So we looked at these solutions. We looked at food waste and diets, not by just reducing emissions, but preserving sinks. We looked at how protecting forests didn't just reduce the deforestation emissions, it kept the forest sinks intact too. And then we looked at how changing agriculture and degrading lands back into production and reversing that can be really important as well. One of the things I want to mention, though, is regenerative agriculture is getting a lot of attention these days. This idea that farms and ranches could be farmed differently to absorb carbon. That is true. There's a lot of great evidence showing that we can grow crops and livestock in ways that can actually absorb carbon, whether in trees, in the forested areas around the farmland, or in agroforestry, or in the soil itself. And that's really exciting. But there are limits to how much this can happen. There's only much soil they can build up, there are only so many trees you can build up, and they are all kind of temporary. The next farmer or a drought or a fire could disturb all of them, putting them back in the atmosphere. So be careful there. There's also a few groups that are not really paying attention to the science, I would say, that are making big, bold claims that regenerative agriculture can absorb all of our greenhouse gas pollution. That is just not true at all. The scientific community is quite clear that it is a solution, but it's one of many solutions, and we've got to make sure we balance it with all the others. So when we look at the numbers, we see that protecting ecosystems and reducing food waste, kind of protecting and taking the pressure off of ecosystems, is critical here to preserving sinks. And then we can put the farmlands and the degraded lands into better systems of agriculture so they absorb carbon too. So this combination of kind of taking pressure off of land, protecting it, and then farming our working lands in different ways can be powerful ways to maintain and enhance land-based carbon sinks. The oceans are kind of different. We don't manage the oceans as much as we might on land. A lot of it's out in the open ocean where we don't do so much. Coastal oceans are another matter, though. But either way, oceans as a whole, even though they take 71% of the planet, absorb 17% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And they do it through three major mechanisms. One is what we call a solubility pump. That's just a fancy way of saying CO2 dissolves in water. And what's interesting here is that salt water dissolves CO2 just like fresh water does. But as water warms up, it absorbs a little less CO2 than cold water. So as the climate changes, we can't really expect the solubility pump to get bigger. It's probably going to stay where it is or maybe go down a little. Then we have something called the carbonate pump, which is where living animals pull carbon dioxide and calcium out of the seawater, and they use it to build a shell. Our shellfish, things like oysters and clams and mussels, but also crabs and lobsters. They pull that stuff out of the water and build shells that stay there for quite a long time. Corals are the same thing too. Remember, corals are animals. They're not plants, they're not rocks. They're little polyp animals that build a calcium carbonate shell around them that we call a coral reef. And that takes CO2 out of the water as well. And then we finally have the biological pump, which is just basically the plants of the ocean. The little tiny microscopic phytoplankton and diatoms that do photosynthesis, as well as what we call macrophytes, or big plants, like kelp forest. They do photosynthesis, they build bigger plants, and those plants will later die and get buried in the ocean's sediment. So all of those things, whether it's just chemistry, building shells, or growing plants, pull carbon out of the air, through the water, and tuck it away. We can do a little bit to help already, obviously. For example, protecting the coastal ecosystems from being developed or torn apart, like mangroves and wetlands and marshes are critical carbon sinks. But also, they turn out to be really helpful in protecting our storm surges on the coastline. When we have healthy mangroves and coral reefs and marshlands and wetlands along the coast, we don't have as much flooding or as much damage from storms. So it kind of helps us prevent climate change, but also adapt the climate changes already here. That's a good win-win in my book. But we might also be able to add new carbon sinks out in the ocean, maybe through farming kelp in big regenerative aquaculture systems, or maybe planting new coral reefs and oyster beds and lots of other things. We're just beginning to explore the possibilities here, and I think they're going to be really cool. So we looked at land and oceans, But then we could look to machines to maybe become carbon sinks. There are machines out there, kind of in laboratory settings and a few very small pilots. The atmosphere is not noticing these things at all yet. They're way too small. But the idea here is maybe we could build machines that would pull carbon out of the atmosphere and either store it down in the rocks somewhere or tuck it away and lock it up, or use it for something. That's the one that gets me really excited. If we could pull carbon out of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or whatever, and use it to make plastics or jet fuel or other things society might want without using oil at all. Use pollution to make our stuff, not new oil. Leave the oil in the ground, we'll take the old stuff out of the air. That would be really cool. This is nowhere near being deployable right now, but some of these technologies are very interesting, and over the next 10 years or so, I think we're going to see a lot more rapid development of these technologies, and they may start to play an important role. So we've looked at the carbon sinks, and before that, the carbon sources. And we can see by reducing pollution, working with nature, and maybe augmenting nature, we've got a lot we can do about climate change. But there's a third principle too, that improving society, not because of climate change, but because it's the right and moral thing to do, turns out to be a great set of climate solutions. It's kind of interesting. And turns out improving equality and equity, especially with women and girls, for example, improving the access to education and healthcare helps women and girls see new opportunities around the world. And as a consequence, women and girls will have maybe fewer children, but healthier children a little bit later in life than they might have otherwise had. And when that's the case, the growth of population in the future might bend down earlier than we thought before. While population growth actually isn't really responsible for most of climate change, most of the emissions are from rich people, not poor people. Future population growth slowing down will actually help us a little bit in the long run as population growth and economic development drive up emissions in the future. So this is a great win-win. By helping women have new opportunities, we might actually help the environment and the climate as well. So it turns out that helping people, for lots of good reasons, actually can help us with climate change as well. And this represents kind of a win-win opportunity to improve human well-being as well as improving our future climate solutions.
All right. Are you guys, is that making noise? I think it is. So we have now done setting the stage, stopping climate change, reducing sources, and supporting sinks and improving society. Those are the 4 videos that we've watched thus far. The next 2 in the series are putting it all together and making it happen. So kind of key in terms of what can we do. He's talked about it, I think, through the different videos, the ideas that they're having. I think the next 2 put it more in our hands as to next steps. So before we kind of move on real quickly, just by a show of hands, who would be interested in having another Climate Solutions 101 where we watch those together versus just watching them on your own? So how many people would be interested in another session on this? Seeing the next 2 together as a group. All right. How many would prefer to just watch it at home at your own time? A few. So kind of half and half. So we can't do it quite yet. April's already full for the church. So we as the forum committee will take a look at whether there is a time that maybe we can come together if there's an interest. But you can always watch this at home. It is available. You can watch the earlier ones. We do have 5 to 10 minutes left of our hour today. So I did want to give a little time for us to just have some discussion on the thoughts that were developed. Before I do that real quickly, so I have the time, I just wanted to let Sarah introduce herself real quickly. Some of the stuff she's doing may help kind of generate those solution ideas too. So.
All right, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to know that people are taking time out of their weekend to think about some of these topics, and I'd like to know, how does this kind of material make you all feel? Does it make you feel excited that there's some things we can do about this problem? Is it a little overwhelming? What are your reactions? It's a little overwhelming, yeah. So first of all, my name is Sarah Mesa. My pronouns are she, her. I completely understand that reaction as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the personal experience I've had overcoming some of that feeling of being overwhelmed by just getting in there and actually doing something, right? To me, that's kind of the antidote. However, the activities I'm involved with are a little bit different than what's been talked about, at least in the videos we saw today, which I think is exciting because I can share something new with you. So I'm group leader of the New Mexico State chapter of an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And what we do is we are a bipartisan advocacy organization that focuses on federal policy solutions, right? So we advocate for federal policy solutions that have, number one, a strong probability of being supported by both Republicans and Democrats. I don't know about you all, but I don't envision a future in the short or even medium term where either one of those two parties has complete control, right? So if we're going to get something through Congress, we need large numbers of people from both sides to get behind it. So number one, we look for areas of agreement there. Number two, we look for areas where we're going to have a meaningful impact on reducing carbon emissions, right? That certainly isn't the only area of concern for people who care about climate. In the videos today, they talked about, plastic pollution in our oceans and stuff like that. So there's lots of other things that people who are interested in climate can also be interested in, but we're focused primarily on policies that will reduce carbon emissions. And so I've been with Citizens Climate Lobby for a few years now. Within about 3 weeks, I was in a virtual lobbying meeting with one of our members of Congress with some of their environmental staff, talking about these policies, letting a federal policymaker know what was important to me as a voter. And it really changed me. And it really made me feel like there's something I can do. I'm not a scientist. I don't always bring my cloth bags with me to the grocery store, right? So I had always approached this from their skills I don't have, but I'm a great speaker and a great conversationalist, and I love getting to know people and building relationships with them, and I can apply that to the work I do in Citizens Climate Lobby. And whether you have 5 minutes once a month or significantly more time to invest, there are things that you can do as well to get involved with advocating for our federal policymakers to be creating situations where we have better choices available to us as consumers, as citizens, as people living in the world, so that we're not polluting as much. So that's kind of my pitch to you. If that's something that you are interested in, I'd love to talk to you more about it, answer any questions you have. And I'd also like to say, has anybody been following in some of the local news some of our high schoolers who are trying to electrify the public schools? So those high schoolers are truly so amazing. I've been watching them take on this leadership role all year, doing things that I feel like if all of the adults in our lives were doing, the world would be a really different place, right? And that's not enough for them. They want to come to Washington, D.C. with us this summer and lobby our members of Congress, and they're fundraising to do it right now. So one of the things I'm going to provide to Tamara and Tyler when I get out of here is the GoFundMe that they're circulating. I know not everybody can contribute, and that's totally okay, but if you would please share it with other people who are interested in this. This entire year they've been doing this for us, right? Trying to make sure our community is healthier and saving more money. And so I would really love our community to step up and make this trip as easy for them as possible by covering some of their costs. So that is one immediate thing that you can do to kind of support what we're working on. And if you're interested in finding out more, I'd love to talk to you about it. So, yeah.
So much. So before we head out into the world, I did want to take the chance, watching these videos today and now a month ago almost, any ideas, any thoughts that were generated, anything you wrote down on your card that you want to share?
You want to go? First thing I was going to check with is, can we actually visit these sites or see them and watch them again?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm interested in, so I can chunk it.
Yeah, so the Project Drawdown has a website. They have, this series we just pulled it from the website. They actually have language. They're wanting it for educational purposes that you can share it just as long as you give them the appropriate credit. The credit is Project Drawdown. It is not us at the church. So I'll send you the link. If anybody else, I'll write down your email. But just a quick Google search, Climate Solutions 101 or Project Drawdown will get you there.
I jotted down a lot of notes, and what struck me was how often I don't properly perceive the level of contribution that different things are making. Particularly like refrigerants. You know, he really drove home that was huge. I didn't write down the percentage, but I remember it was substantial. But the fact that 6% of greenhouse gases is coming from these fugitive sources, you know, like flaring and leakage of wells and stuff, and then flying 1.8% versus plastics 1.5%. You know, we think of plastics as being this enormous deal, and he's, you know, saying it is, and he says population growth is to some extent, but it's like, you know, these fugitive leaks are so much bigger, and it sounds like refrigerants are so much bigger issues. So it's just, it'd be nice to see them ranked sort of in order of, you know, how many greenhouse gases does this produce, and with whatever technologies and efforts are fairly reasonable for us to grasp in the next 5 years, how much could we reduce that 5% or that 2% or whatever?
Had a lot of those same thoughts too. They're surprising.
Yes, I had several questions along the way or observations. First of all, I didn't hear him mention it, but I've heard that there's been some experimenting with plant breeding in order to try to get versions that do a bigger contribution to absorbing than the ones that we have. I mean, they weren't built to do our job for us, so you need to push them to do it better. So that's one thought. I wrote down that he wasn't taking population seriously, but at the very end he did. So that's, it's still the biggie for me. I always am very caught up in the fact that, you know, I've been through the part of life where you use equations to express things, and the kind of input you'd have for describing many of the things that are here always have amount per person times number of people. That's the way it works. And if you deal with one and not the other, you don't necessarily do any good. If one goes down and the other goes up, you haven't gotten anywhere. And I don't think that that style of thinking enters into their arguments very often. So I'm not sure they really see it as deeply as they could. At any rate, I then wondered along the way how much fuel was used and how much carbon dioxide or the like is produced from electric cars, because they're consuming energy that's generated off somewhere else, possibly with coal-fired power plants. It's never been obvious to me that we're describing what's going on properly. So I'd like to, have those things made clearer. I then asked myself something about my front yard. Is letting wild stuff grow there better than a lawn? Are weeds better than grass is the way I like to put it. I'd like to say yes because I love to let the weeds grow. But I have these questions as this goes on that don't get answered. Then I had a really big question that has to do with sources and sinks, because we are responsible for sources that go on at some pace year after year after year. So our sources are a continuous flow. Now, a lot of the sinks, you grow a tree, and while it's growing, it's doing things. It does have a life thereafter, but, at what point is it taking up the carbon dioxide? And is it a process that goes on indefinitely, or is it a process that goes on while it's growing, and eventually it's gotten there, and it's not a continuous sink? So I think there's something about sources and sinks that they aren't making clear in the discussion.
Kind of raises a lot of questions to do a lot more research on, right? We need to have the guy come and talk to us and answer the questions, because I can't answer them all. I don't think I'm the right expert to try to answer any of them, because you'd probably not get the correct answer. But I think it is definitely thought-provoking for sure. Any other thoughts? I know I just recently on CNN, they had this opinion article that was, should we know the horrors or something of climate change? Do people care? Should we be informing people? And so I read it thinking it was going to tell me about what are the problems with climate change and how to solve them. And all it was whether people should know or not, and it didn't actually have anything about climate change. It's like, I think we actually need the knowledge, was my ultimate thought. But yes?
Just kind of a comment on that. Is everybody familiar with the Yale program on climate change communications? They're a really good program out of Yale. They have administered kind of opinion surveys on climate change twice a year since like 2008. And these are people who are statisticians, specialists in constructing and doing really good surveys. So I have a high level of confidence in their results. And so most recently, they're finding that people who are skeptical that climate change is happening, those people are a really small minority in this country. They're outnumbered by everybody else by like 8-1 or something like that. So that's one interesting thing. Another interesting thing is they provide a lot of good information on how to talk to people, and how to talk to people and what you tell them really does depend on where they fit in the spectrum of skeptical to alarmed, basically. It's called Global Warming 6 Americas, and so they define kind of like 6 populations with different sizes. And there are some people for whom telling them all this bad stuff is happening isn't helpful, right? It kind of depends on where you are. Even people who do benefit from learning about that, you've got to give them something to do about it, right? You can't just say all this horrible stuff is happening. People feel overwhelmed. They feel like there's nothing they can do, and they give up. So I tend to, I want the facts too, but I also want that other part, like, so what? What can I do?
So I think, I may be wrong, I don't want to put into anybody's mind, but I think there's a fairly decent consensus, at least within us, that climate change is one of the top problems of facing the world these days, that I think most people do want to learn more about in our community. So thank you all for coming out to listen to this. We'll talk as a forum about whether, at the forum committee, whether it makes sense or whether we have time to have another session for the last 2 videos. That time component is kind of key there. But it may be something that if there is enough interest, that at least, whether it's this or not, we continue to have climate discussions as part of the forums.
One other thing to consider in terms of watching this on your own, if you just Google Climate Solutions 101, it'll take you into the right part of Project Drawdown. But it also allows you to stop it and go back and listen to that again, and because there's just so much data in here. And it's very well presented, but it's just coming fast and furious. So that's a plus to watch it on your own. And the nice thing is, if you've seen these 2 parts, the rest is the summary. So it's going to be pulling it all together is the next one, and what can we do is the last one. So consider that option too.
Tyler, before we go, do you want to do a plug for next Sunday real quick while we have everybody here?
Yeah, the forum next Sunday is one that I'm really excited about. Deborah Taffa is an author who will be speaking, and she has a new memoir that Oprah is touting, and she's getting good reviews elsewhere, the Washington Post and so forth. She is a native person, partly of Pueblo ancestry, grew up in Farmington, works in Santa Fe. I've heard her speak twice at Collected Works in Santa Fe, and she's really comes across well, thoughtful, calm, interesting. So she, because of book tour, she can't be here at this time of the day next week. We're doing it at night instead. So we're hoping that nighttime will work, and we're offering some dessert stuff afterwards as a little extra enticement. And her books will be for sale here. So I'd encourage everybody to check this out. It'll kind of, once again, sort of expand our awareness of what growing up native in New Mexico is really like. Oh, I'm sorry, it's at 7 p.m. next Sunday night. It'll be in here, food in the fellowship hall.
We had to double book our April, so I figured put it out there while we can. All right, well, thank you all, and feel free to continue the discussion jointly, if anybody wants to hang out, if you want to talk with Sarah, etc. And we'll let you know if we can do the next round. We may be limited on time, but like I said, do just Google Climate Solutions 101. It will take you right there. If not, give me your email and I'll send you the link. All right? Thank you very much.